everyone, this is Insane in the Endgame with Grandmaster Denes Boros, late night edition. So this time we are going to look at some tricks and traps in the endgames and some less tricky versions of the same endgames. So the first one is a classical little study. Some of you might consider it a little bit funny. So it is white to move and win, and it won't be your usual I build a bridge and you can't cross it. So here you actually have to use something that we call chess magic combinations. So it is white to move, and just sprinkle some joy for everybody. Gil Wolf already knows everything. Good, good. If you know everything, that's what you need. It is magic time, Patrick Daly. It's always magic time, especially if it's endgame. So we see a check, we give a check. Yes. So now the king can't really go there because you slide over to c8, queen, and then you celebrate football style. So black has to go to e7. And I even make it as the main move. As I told you guys, here the basic I am going to build a bridge ain't gonna work, and it ain't gonna fly. So we've got to use something that Mihaltal would call a brilliancy. Yep. So let's get into the zone and find the right way. Okay. Some people want to give a full rook for free. But is it time to donate yet? I don't think so. At least you have to convince me that it's time for some donation. Now, if you go rook e2 check, I go back, and you ain't crossing this bridge. So I don't know about rook e2. Indeed. So it is actually time to donate with rook d6. But, I mean, normally you'd ask, why the rook move? Well, if black just passes, you actually build a bridge. And when you check, I can go rook c6. So if you go back a little bit, you go king c7, you would get checked. Rook d6. King takes d6, and now the king elegantly walks out just to have a little bit of a sunbath. And after check, king d8, and we're asking, who's going to stop that pawn? Now mind you, this does not work if there's no b6 pawn. There would be rook b3 pressing down that pawn on b7 and on the b8 square. So it is very important that there is an extra b-pawn hiding the b7 one. So you can see that even in endgames, there are some tactical ideas that you can use to win a game. And there's no way of stopping queening. All right, and a second note there, you can't really set up this checkmate because when you go here, this queen's with a check, and it is GG time, meaning the game is over. Literally, you're going to lose the rook, and then going to face two queens, and in that case, you stand no chance at all. Good start, good start. This is the first thing that I wanted to show. So I am going to show you another one between Nigel short and Judit Polgar. We're going to start from the middle game, but we're going to fast forward into endgame territory. So b takes, bishop takes c5. White has the pressure, but it'll only lead to a rook endgame. So takes, rook a8, rook c8, takes, rook b8, rook a7. We're not really interested in this phase, so we're just going to fast forward. By the way, h4 is a very nice move, trying to inconvenience that bishop on g6. h5, bishop f3, queen f6, bishop takes h5, takes, rook c8, rook takes, king g8. And here we're going to be at a halt for a second. So whenever you get this position, you get your bets out. Is this going to be a win for white, or is it going to be a draw? Now, again, don't look at the result, look at the position. First thoughts. Draw. I hear from Aryan Gutla. Not wrong, not wrong. Why do we think this should be a draw? Well, it's mostly because the pawn advantage is on the same side, and it is a notorious rook endgame. So, according to theory, this should be a draw. Now, g4 is a very nice move by Judit, the best female player of all time. You do need to cram down your opponent's pawns as quickly as possible. And you're going to see the same method played in other games that I'm going to show. The c-pawn is falling. There's no way of actually defending it. So Judit makes sure that she gets to move forward in that time. Rook takes c3, king g2, g6, rook b5. And whenever you get these theoretical positions, it's very important to theorize what would be your best chance. Now, mind you, whenever you get into rook endgames, everybody is low on time and time trouble is abundant. So you need to find the best practical try here. Best tactical try and best practical try, exactly what I mean, is trying to envision what pawn exchanges would actually give hope for a win for white. I see Andreas Skottheim saying f5 can be played, but it's tricky. Okay. What is the point of pushing the f pawn? What are you trying to achieve? So one of the things that you could do is push this pawn up or play h5. Passer. But there is one thing that is stronger than a passer. What is that? So actually there's a choice. Either you start pushing f4, f5, or you play h5. Well, an active king is a good thing, but it ain't better than a passer. A passer is basically our hope to win a game. The thing that's better than a passed pawn is a protected passed pawn. Gil knows his endgames, correct. So if we know that, then we can make an educated guess which one Judit played in this position. If we talk so much about a protected pass pawn. I mean, black did play king g7, but the point is, what was Judit planning to do? Did she go for f4, f5 or h5? The answer is f4, f5. If you play h5, you're actually eliminating one of your potential passers. And if you take, now you do create a passer, but you also create a target. And if you lose that pawn, that is 90% a draw. There's no way you're going to win that game. And with these pawns being awfully close, that pawn actually defending the g6 square, this is very cut and dry and pretty much a draw. However, Judit is going to go for the idea of f4, f5, hoping to create a passed pawn out of the h pawn. So let's see what she does. She plays f3. Excuse me. And whenever we look at these games, you might wonder why don't they play f4, f5 immediately? Because both of the players are usually in time trouble by this phase, so it makes sense to execute a plan in a drawn-out fashion, sort of tiring out the opponent. Chess, as you might know from the previous classes by Dorsa Derakshani, is part sport and part psychology. Here, f3 makes a point of, hey, I'm in no hurry, you are here for a long struggle. By the way, g5 wouldn't be such a great idea, because in this sense, you would create a target there and you would lose the potential idea of creating a passed h-pawn. So with f3, Judit Polgar is trying to keep things flexible. Rook c4, a very nice move by Nigel Short, making sure that this king cannot cross the fourth barrier. King g3, rook a4, rook b3, rook c4. And here comes the time where black is going to go shuffle back and forth, but we'll see if that actually works out for him. Now, if we play f4 right here, then Nigel Short would start giving checks and perpetually start attacking those pawns. And in this case, you would never be able to play f5. That's why Judit first over-defends the third rank and then starts pushing the f-pawn. Rook b3, rook c4, f4 now. So one of the key things to do when you're attacking and also sort of defending is to make sure that your opponent can't get too active. So rook b3 just makes sure that the third rank is protected. Rook a4, rook f3, preparing this f5 move. Rook b4, f5. Now, in these technical endgames, sometimes you get half a goal accomplished. Now f5 ain't winning, but it's half a goal accomplished by Judit, and now she is going to have that passer that she was dreaming of. gf, rook takes f5, and voila, rook a4, oh, jumped a little bit, f5, rook takes, rook a4, h5, and now she has a protected passed pawn. So that is something to brag about. Now, a little bit, let's try to think of the defender's side. h5 is menacing, but there is another big threat in this position. What could that be? So why did black go g takes f5? Well, it's simple. Nigel Short felt that the position should be close to draw in this case, so he felt no reason to avoid it. Advancing the king, that's one idea. What else could come to mind? g5, indeed. if white gets g5, it actually gets a little bit dodgy because eventually that f-pawn might get under attack, and the closer she gets to that promotion square, the harder it gets to defend. So by that definition, we might just know what Nigel played in this position. Indeed, is the dreaded f6 move. But here it makes a lot of sense. You're just stopping that advance. If h6, this is a complete draw, with the king being in front of the pawn. There's no hope of ever winning this. So obviously, Judit is going to avoid that. And also stops these king h4, king g5 ideas as well. Rook d5. Now rook d5 is these mysterious moves which, it's hard to understand sometimes. However, this rook was in the way, and probably what Judit imagined is to bring this king up to f5. It's kind of tough to do so if the rook is in the way. So she went rook d5. Rook b4. And here comes a probing check. Rook d7 check. So Chet, where would you bring your king? Where would you bring your king if you're faced with this choice? King g9. That's a very safe move, but highly illegal. Now, if you go king h6, you actually sort of entrapping your own king. Rook f7, and you're forced to go back to b6, because king g5 loses immediately to this check, and you lose the pawn. And once you go back, I will walk over to f5, and it's getting very dodgy. So here you had to go king g8, as a lone rook and pawn will not win the game, and the king is still cut off. But Judit still tries, plays king h4, sort of preparing some like h6, king h5. It's more of a ghost threat, but a ghost threat is still a threat and something that short has to figure out. So if your opponent is trying to walk on in this way, how can you stop it? Stop that idea. Rook b1, indeed. If they're trying to walk upstairs, you're going to check them from behind. This is actually a typical way of defending in these type of positions. King g3, Judit says, I tried, and short says, I know, you did. So, attempt 1, Nigel short, Judit Polgar, 1-0. However, the probing didn't end. How else can Judit try to improve on her position? H6, we talked about that. She will play that, but it's not enough. The king is not close enough to help out with the attack. H6 is, by the way, very committal. When you're trying to induce a mistake from your opponent, you shouldn't be overtly committal in a rook endgame, because it might just fizzle out on the spot. Yep. So you want to get that king in. So the easiest way is to use your rook as a shield. Remember, you're up a pawn, so any exchange would favor you. In fact, would provide you a winning position. So she played king f3, rook a4, rook e7. Just setting up this idea. So short will have to abandon this fourth rank. King f8, rook e4, and now a little bit of a success by a Judit. Rook a1. Now you can't really go king f4 yet because you would get these dreaded checks from behind and you're back in square one. But Judit has something else in mind. Rook b4. You can check me if you want to, but then I either go king e4 or king f4. You're not really stopping me. So this is actually a success by Judit. She did occupy the fourth rank. So now if you're forced to be a little bit more defensive as black, what would be an ideal formation? Is it good that this king is on the 8th? Is that the ideal place for black's king? Now, as we talked about it, the king does not want to be on h6, no. So was it fun when the rook was on the 7th? And I'll tell you what, it wasn't. Therefore, short says, hey, I'm going to defend the 7th, get my king to g7, and I'm going to chill. I'm not saying that rook e1 is necessarily bad, because that's the other method. You could always go for these partisan checks and hope that you can hold that way. But in chess, there are multiple ways to achieve the same result. You can be aggressive, but that you have to be accurate in that way, or you can be defensive, which sometimes takes a little bit less effort, which might have been preferred because we're closing to time control, meaning the end zone where everyone is running out of time. So rook a7 is a safe choice by Nigel Short. And it is time for us to reap the benefits of our plans. What did Judit play here? Yep. Why not king f4? Indeed, that's what she played. King e4, king f4, same old, same old. King g7. And now this is again a grandmaster move that is overlooked. Some of you might just play king f5 here, but then you're facing these checks. But grandmasters know that you're going to check them. So Judit stops you before you could even dream about that check. Rook a4 check, king f5, rook a7. Now, Short says, okay, your king is on f5. Your rook is on b5. But what's the big deal? Obviously, g5 does not accomplish anything because we get into these positions, which is completely drawn. The king is in front of the pawn, and you can never get on the 7th. Also, every rook exchange leads to a drawn endgame. So she played rook d5, rook e7. Believe it or not, a bad mistake. Okay. tactics, exactly, yep. You're looking for tactics, but looking forward to a full solution. Indeed, h6 check. And this is kind of the trick. Sometimes you are trying to lull your opponent's awareness and lull them to sleep. And in this case, with h6, Black ran into this devious little trap by Judit, and the rook is not far enough to check. Also, it's attacked once you move the rook. Rook h5, checkmate. So the only move here is king f7. It's not over yet. You still have to be precise as Judit. It's one thing to set up a trick. You've got to still be resolute. So at the moment we can tell that these guys are a little bit unfortunately placed. However, our king is prone to checks that we wouldn't want to see. If you go h7, there's king g7. So it's not that crystal clear. There's a much more simple move by Judit that actually wins the game. If you go rook d8, I give a rook e5 check, and you're back to square one and probably ain't winning the game either. Yep, g5 is the big move by Judit, making sure that there are no rook e5 funny business, and the unfortunate placement of the rook and the king means that h7, h8 is unstoppable, and Nigel short has no way of stopping that. If the rook was on the side somewhere else, b7, c7, this would still be a complete draw. But as you can see, one slip in a technically drawn endgame is enough, and Judit just sweeps the game. Rook e1 was played, h7 takes, check, king f4, and Nigel Short resigned. Indeed, Short's only mistake was rook e7. His plan of setting up the fortress with f6, rook a7, and this sort of passive or more defensive setup was completely fine until rook e7, which fell into this nice little tactical idea of h6 and rook d8. I mean g5, rook d8. Talking about escaping, there is another very famous game by Judit Polgar, which we're going to take a quick look at, and it was played between Grischuk and Judit. So we are going to start from here. This is still the middle game. We're going to fast forward to the critical moment. Also, we're going to flip the board because we're going to watch it from Judit's perspective. Knight e7, takes, d5. Judit was mostly in the back foot in this game, but as you can see, she will be fighting tooth and nail to stay afloat. Takes, this is still not what we're looking for. Here, she is looking for active counterplay, which is very important. Knight a7, knight c6, knight e5, here takes. Knight e4, king g2, knight f6. here, king h6, knight e6, and we are going to start from this position. White is obviously having the upper hand, but it does not mean you can't continue on to fight. So you can tell if you're just continuing with passive defense, it's not going to help you out too much. So how should we continue as Judit? Well, obviously, you should be looking for active counterplay. You should be super aggressive. If they take, at least you can go knight e4 and hope for some tricks against the king. Knight g7, king g6, knight d5. Again, setting up some trickies, and as you may as well know, if you've played chess before, even in winning positions, you can lose. So rook c1 is the only move, because if you go here, it is immediately bye-bye. You just lose the game. Knight e3 check, and the king cannot really run away. So rook c1 is, surprisingly enough, is the only move, although obviously it keeps the advantage. Rook d2, rook e1, king f5 is taking good. We don't really want to take because then we would be down 2 pawns, but actually we will be forced to get there. Rook d1, knight c5, knight f6, h3, and so far actually Grischuk is playing quite well and this position is objectively winning. f3, rook d4, knight e4. You don't want to get into the endgame because you would be losing. Takes, 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 and the king comes in front, and that's a loss. So knight d5, rook d2, rook takes d2, knight takes d2, king g5, king f2, king f5, and we are getting into this critical position. King g5, f4 check. And this is actually the critical point. What is the best practical chance for black in this position? Passive defense or active defense? Active defense. Correct. So, if we want to be aggressive, that is being active in chess, how should we do that in this position? Forward. King g4, knight e5 check, king h3, king f3. And believe it or not, in this position, Judit found a splendid idea which actually draws the game. Knight g4, which is a fantastic find by Judit. And believe it or not, you can't capture because it's a stalemate. And impossible as it may, you can't really win this position because the g pawn is just too weak, and you will face this perpetual idea of knight h2, knight g4, and taking on g4, as we already talked about, is taboo. Knight d3, that's the way Grischuk tried. Knight h2 check, king e4, knight g4 back. So if Judit manages to pick one pawn from Grischuk's position, she can just give up the knight on g4, and it's a completely draw position because it's a king versus king and a knight, and there's no material left to win with. Knight e5, and how should we continue here? This is still an important position. If you go knight f2, you might let this king run. So yes, you won a pawn, but you're actually kind of far away with this knight. Probably you can still hold, but knight f2 is a bit too adventurous. Knight f6 check indeed, because if you go here, I can just take on g3. If you capture, I take the pawn, and as we all know, this is a draw. So king f3 is forced. And I presume you've seen this position before. Knight g4 again. Knight g4 is the same stalemate, so Grischuk has to come up with a new plan. Knight c4, knight h2 check. Now if you keep going back and forth, well, Judit will go back and forth with knight g4, knight h2. King e4, knight f1, and that is actually typical of these knights. You are coming closer by going farther away. f5 would actually run into knight takes g3 check, and I'm picking up the pawn. You have to make a king move, and I pick this pawn. So Grischuk went knight e3, knight g3, king e5, king h2, king d6, knight h5, f5, and knight g7 immediately forces the draw after f6. And draw was agreed because knight e8 check is coming, and you lose the f-pawn. Knight e8. Here the draw was agreed, but knight e8 would be a draw. So, as you can see, tactics do work in endgames as well. However, last but not least, I do want to show you guys a Capablanca classic versus Yates, where Capablanca shows his beautiful technique. Now even there were some drawing chances for Yates, and we're going to take a look at that one. So we're going to start from this position. Now, it's 4 versus 3, the dreaded position, which is known to be a draw. However, it is white to move, which kind of changes things. Now, if you were black in this position, it was your move, what would you play? H4, okay. G4, yes. G4 is a very important move made by the big Kappa, because if you just pass, H5 happens, and if you cannot create a passer as white, you're not going to win this game. So G4 is an important move, sort of fixing this pawn on H7. H6, King G3, Rook C1, King G2, not in a hurry. And that's actually the way to play these rook endgames. You're never in a rush. rook c4, rook d5. I think we've seen this move before in Judit's game versus Short. Sort of threatening rook d4, chasing this rook away from the fourth. Rook a4, f4, rook a2, king g3, rook e5, rook e1, king f2. And again, in this position, we need to create a passer or slash a target on h6. How can we do that? How is it possible to achieve that in this position? Yep, h4, h5. That's actually the big concept. You are going to try to exchange of a pawn here so you can create a passer out of the e and f pawns. Also, this guy on h6 can potentially become a target. King f6, h5, rook e2 check, king f3, rook e1, rook a5. King g7 takes, king takes g6. And in general, whenever you get this 4 against 3, you would be trying to get a pass pawn out of the e and f pawns if it's possible, which actually happened in a similar game between Aronyan and Nakamura, but talk about that another time. H takes, and that's kind of the reason why Yates doesn't take with the f pawn, because that would mean this e pawn has a free route to go to, and they might even become protected pass pawns like tanks roaming down the board. So king takes g6 actually is illogical. e4, rook f1, king g3, check, king h3, and you do not have these perpetual ideas because you just don't have enough space to attack these guys. So then rook f1, rook f5. In no rush, first off, he is defending that pawn and plans to set up a little bit of an outpost on e5. Rook e1, e5, check, king g2, rook a3. So far, quite a decent defense by Yates. This king is cut off, and as we all know, it's very difficult to win a rook endgame or any type of endgames with a king being far, far away from the action. Rook f6, king g7, rook b6, rook e3, rook b4. Again, making sure everything's defended. Now f6, which would be a thematic idea to undermine, just fails to this check and rook b6, and you'd drop a pawn. So rook c3. Now in this position, we need to come forward with the king. Yes, king f2. However, king f2 is a little bit inaccurate. So if you're defending this position, this might be critical for you. There is one important move that Yates missed right here, possibly giving him drawing chances. Yeah, in hindsight, definitely rook e4 might be a little bit better. h5, yes. So if they take the pawn, you go rook h3, and we're going to have a 2 against 1. White has some chances, but objectively is a draw. And if you go g5, you go h4, and this pawn is just going to be enough of a nuisance to hold the draw. But Yates misses it. Rook b7, king g8, check again, king g7, f5. And with these pawns rolling down the board, Black will have to do something about it. Because if you wait around, you're actually going to face f6 check. You can't go up there because check, and you lose the pawn on f7. And if you go here, e6, and you're promoting. e6, f takes, f7, and it's promoting. So actually, one of the ideas that you have to look for is the concept of getting your rook there, get your e and f pawn on the 5th, and threaten ideas such as f6 and e6. So here Yates panicked and started checking, but that only means that the king is coming and bolting forwards. Rook a4, king d5. Same thing, you can't really take it because you run into this f6 idea. Rook a5, king d6, rook a6, king c7. Just hiding away from those checks, and more f6 is looming in the air. Note, if you go f6, I'm going to play e6, and that is a protected pass pawn, very much likely just to give a win. King h7, king d7. As the king hides away, this king might as well just come and creep closer to the f-pawn. Rook a7, king d6 check. King d6, avoiding the check. King g7, rook d8, again using the rook as a shield. Rook a5, but now you get that f6 check in. Rook f8. Now e6 wouldn't really work because of this side check. So rook f8. You can go king g6 because of the aforementioned rook g8 and rook g7. Rook a7, king c6, and slowly but surely, now Yates is running out of oxygen. King g6, check, rook g7 here. Now in this position, you really have to be mindful of a crazy rook, but there's that extra h-pawn, which is fixed. So I don't have to really worry about that much. King b6, rook d7, king c5, sort of triangling closer, and e6 is coming. Rook c7, king d6, okay, 7, e6 now, check, king e7, takes rook e4, and here comes the final touch that might be familiar from a previous game, and that will clinch this match for Capablanca. So it's white to move and play. Yeah, e6 was a big move over there. g5, indeed. Again, you are creating this umbrella idea. You have no more checks, and after you get there, you start rolling with the pawn. So either you go there and win that way, or if they go rook e8, you check here, f7, and you might not even take the rook because you can promote to a lady on e8. So after king g6, Yates resigned. And that kind of concludes our session on tricks and traps in endgames. One single trap can win you a game, but don't forget, you need to activate your king in each and every try. Thank you for watching, and good night. Take care.